So I'm in Poland with my wife and her family for the summer, and bit by bit, I've been picking up some of this very challenging language. Man, it's going to be a struggle to learn this. But there are the occasional words that I've learned that are starting to stand out to me. And one word in particular that I've been thinking about for a couple of weeks now is the Polish word for boar. The Polish word for boar is dzik. Dzik is a boar, like a boar in the woods, right? Dzik. And what I find most interesting about this is that the Polish word for wild is dziki. Dziki, like to be boary. Like, dzik is a boar, and something that is wild is dziki. It's like to be like a boar. And so what's also kind of funny is to say wild boar is dziki dzik, which I think is kind of funny. But the reason why I've been thinking about this is it's so fascinating to me that the boar is it's such a wild, untamed, irascible creature that even in the Polish language they basically just took the word for it and used the animal itself to be the descriptor for what wild itself means. And I find that very interesting because this is something you see in mythology and fairy tales, is boars and swine and pigs like this are often associated, especially if they're wild, they're associated with what's called the chthonic or the dark feminine. They're associated with the dark, natural, wild side of the Great Mother. They're associated with the earthly, chthonic underworld feminine. And what's also very interesting is that boars, you often see are these wild beasts that they will wound a hero or a would-be king, specifically. And the two examples that I'm thinking about are, one is, a lot of people have probably seen the Odyssey most recently, and Odysseus faced a boar. And the other example I'm thinking of is the first season of Game of Thrones, who was the king Robert Baratheon, and his encounter with the boar. What I find interesting about this is that both of these characters were kings, but both were very different kings, and both had a very different outcome with their encounter with the wild boar. Odysseus, you can say, would be a good king, which I guess the modern interpretation doesn't necessarily paint him in that way, but if you're looking at the actual myth, Odysseus was a benevolent, good king. He didn't necessarily originally want to go to war. He only went because his son was going to be conscripted in his place, and he did his solemn duty to protect his family. And it was his cunning that actually ended the war. He didn't want involvement with the war. He certainly didn't start the war, and then the irony is he's the man who ends the war. He didn't have any superpowers like Achilles, or didn't have the bravery of Hector. He didn't have the strength of Ajax. He wasn't any of these other heroes of the war, and yet he was the greatest hero of them all, which I find very interesting. And then his journeys bring him home, and he's an even more actualized king upon returning home, and he was renowned as being a benevolent, loving king to begin with. Well, sorry, there's a bug flying around. When he was a young king, if you remember, I think they showed this in the movie briefly, he had an encounter with a wild boar. He was out hunting, boar charged him, he ends up ending it, but the boar still gores him in I think it was the foot or the leg, and it leaves a lasting scar. But he obviously survives the wound and overcomes it and goes on for the rest of the story. Now what's so interesting is he was a good king who had this encounter with a dziki dzik, a wild boar. We can even put boar aside. He had an encounter with the wild, and he survived it, and he went on to become a good king. You contrast this with Game of Thrones' Robert Baratheon. He goes on a boar hunt, has a little too much wine, which ended up being spiked or poisoned or whatever it was. He misses his spear thrust against a boar out in the wild, and then the boar gores him and leaves a grievous wound that he perishes from. Now, Robert Baratheon, he was an excellent warrior, but he was not a good king. He wasn't a good ruler. He was not faithful to his wife. He was not a man of deep honor and integrity. He didn't know how to actually be a benevolent ruler of the kingdom. He just wanted to drink and philander and fight. That's what he was. And so what's so fascinating is like you've got this good king who survives the encounter with the wild feminine. And you've got this bad / incompetent king. He wasn't necessarily a bad guy, but he was not a competent, benevolent one either. He does not survive his encounter with the wild feminine. And this seems to be a mythological and symbolic motif that is not just these examples, these are just the most immediate ones that come to my mind. This seems to be a motif that, at least on a man's journey, maybe this is different for women, in fact I would say it almost certainly is, but for a man's journey, so much of a man's journey is, it's like the formation of your ego, it's the solidification of your consciousness, it's to become sharper and more piercing and, more identified with the known and the conscious. But to actualize yourself as a king, you have to integrate the opposite. You have to integrate the feminine, the queen within. You can't crown yourself king. The queen within has to crown you king, and that's the feminine principle. And I think the way that the feminine principle actualizes that in you is typically it's her dark side first. It's her wild side. It's the wild, earthly, chthonic, dark feminine side of the Great Mother, who she pierces the veil and leaves a wound that opens enough of a hole for your soul to actually pour out of. And I think the boar is a symbolic representation of this, because the boar is the wild. It is the feminine. It's why old fertility goddesses were so heavily associated with pigs and swine, like Demeter or Ishtar. These were all heavily associated with pigs. Pigs were often a fertility icon. I also think, as a sidebar, it's why the Abrahamic religions are oftentimes very opposed to consuming pigs. Part of it is it's said for health reasons and for parasites and things like this, but I'm not certain that's entirely the truth. Part of me speculates that it's because in those more patriarchal-oriented Abrahamic religions, there is a very strong aversion to the feminine, and in most particular, the chthonic, earthly feminine. And pigs were the representation of that, and so there's a very deep rejection of that in all of its forms, even the symbolic form of the animal that is the chthonic feminine. Anyways, I think the boar represents, it's like the dark feminine, the earthly feminine, wounds the would-be king. And if enough of his soul can pour through and he integrates and actualizes that, he can become the good, righteous, benevolent king who rules magnanimously. But if he can't integrate that, the unconscious overwhelms him, his ego can't sustain the flood of the unconscious, he succumbs to it and he perishes. That's the contrast between Odysseus as the former and Robert Baratheon as the latter. And the feminine seems to do this in a pretty grievous way, as like she just comes in this wild form and just gores you, or it's a monster who bites you, or it's an illness that affects you, or it's something like that. And in doing this, it's piercing a deeper hole into the ego consciousness for more of the right kind of unconscious material to flood in. And if you can then integrate that, you integrate more of your own soul. The feminine is now coming into your masculine consciousness, and you actualize your potential as a man. And if you don't, well, you got marked, but I guess you couldn't rise to it, or the right was too overwhelming. So anyways, I got a lot more thoughts on this. I'm already approaching, it's a 9-minute video here, so appreciate those who are still with me on this kind of esoteric, abstract material, but just something I've been thinking about. The word really stuck it to me, of that the word for boar, jik, became also the word for wild, jiki. And just how there's so many associations in mythology and fairy tales and literature and even contemporary stuff. It's not just the old stuff, it's even modern stuff still uses these same ideas of like, it's the wild feminine pierces the masculine, and in doing so, the unconscious is going to flood into him, the feminine unconscious, and he either integrates it and rises into his actualized full potential, or he succumbs to it and he is no king. Yeah. Curious to hear your guys' thoughts on this. I hope some of this resonated or maybe connected some dots, and see you guys in the next one.